Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tim Blotz from Fox 9 in Minneapolis. Welcome to our streaming coverage here of Day 10 of the federal civil rights trial for the three former Minneapolis police officers who assisted in the arrest of George Floyd. The three officers are Tu Tao, J. Alexander King, and Thomas Lane. They are accused of depriving George Floyd of his civil rights on May 25th of 2020 when he was placed under arrest after trying to pass a counterfeit bill at the Cup Foods convenience store on 38th in Chicago here in Minneapolis. Derek Chauvin, who is the fourth police officer on the scene during that moment, has already pleaded guilty in this federal civil rights case. And he is also in prison for the death of George Floyd on those state murder charges from last year. Now, Rob Olson has been in federal court throughout the duration of this trial so far. And Rob, let's start right away with the new expert witness for the prosecution today. He's Dr. Vic Babarda, and he is a professor of emergency medicine at the University of Colorado. And part of his specialty is toxicology. And given his testimony today, it kind of seems, Rob, that at least the federal prosecutors here are trying to reinforce their case that George Floyd did not die from drugs and that his death really could have been prevented.
Yeah, very much so. He, Dr. Babarda from the University of Colorado, medical toxicology and pharmacology and emergency medicine. He's a professor. They extensively went over his background, which was pretty lengthy. But basically, when they got right down to it, what he said, he determined, is that George Floyd died because of a lack of oxygen to his brain, and then that caused his heart and his lungs to stop functioning. The cardiopulmonary arrest is what that is. The heart and lungs stop beating and breathing because of a lack of oxygen to the brain. And he said his determination is that lack of oxygen was because of the airway restriction from Derek Chauvin's knee, also the pressure on his back as well as he lay prone on the pavement. So that basically reinforces other things that the prosecution has presented here with the medical opinions that this was asphyxia that cut off the air supply, which led to the death, and then that this could have been prevented by actions prior to George Floyd going unconscious and then dying, his heart and lungs failing to function anymore there at 38th in Chicago.
Rob, a key part of the testimony for the prosecution is when Dr. Babarda said that he saw in the videotape and images both former officers King and Lane checking for George Floyd's pulse on both his wrist and his ankle, and that if they had found no pulse, they should have immediately taken action, right? Could you walk us through that?
Yeah, and that has been something that has been repeatedly questioned by both prosecution and defense of many of these experts, that Officer King, former Officer King, checked for George Floyd's pulse in his wrist. Former Officer Lane checked on his ankle, and you can hear on the body-worn camera video that neither says that they can find a pulse. So a lot of these experts are asked, where is the best place to check for a pulse? And they all say the carotid artery. Now, obviously, Officer King was holding George Floyd's left arm, so the wrist was accessible to him. Lane was down holding his feet, so the ankle was accessible to him, so that's where they checked. I think what the prosecution and defense are really going after here, they believe they should have checked his carotid artery. What the defense, I think, is then going after here is saying that they were not able to. This is what was accessible to him. In that if you can't find a pulse there, that is not the best place to determine if there's no pulse, that you really need to check the carotid artery. So the defense is really kind of setting the stage for that these officers wouldn't necessarily know for sure that he did not have a pulse. I think that's the doubt that they're trying to place there, that even though they couldn't find pulse in those locations, they knew that that didn't necessarily mean there was no pulse, where the prosecution is trying to really paint out for the jury here that they should have checked the carotid artery, although, again, the defense will point out Chauvin's knee was in the way, and maybe they couldn't reach that.
And Rob, it also seemed that he gave very similar testimony to Dr. Systrom, who testified on Monday. And Dr. Systrom is from from Boston. He's a pulmonologist there. And both of these medical experts seem to indicate and say that when George Floyd lost consciousness that day, that was the opportunity to roll him over on his side. And if they would have done that, the chances of saving his life would have been greatly increased.
Yeah, he said he had, in viewing the videos, that he said he viewed the 3 body camera videos as well as the bystander video to really look for the signs and the symptoms, what George Floyd was doing, which is why he says this is clearly a case of somebody not getting enough oxygen, because it's not a sudden death. You see him slowing down, you see his movements slowing, and then you see the involuntary movements of his legs, and that, he said, is a result of that's a body reaction when now there's not enough oxygen in the tissues and in the bloodstream. He said, yeah, he seemed to have decreased movement, decreased talking, progressively got slower and slower and slower, that he determined that George Floyd lost consciousness at 8:24 p.m. and 50 seconds. That is from the time codes on those videos. That he, when you mentioned here, what we were getting at, I'm sorry, is that had they reacted right away, and this came in towards the end of the prosecution's questioning. In fact, they wrapped up with this, saying that prior to losing consciousness, had his airway been opened by either relieving the pressure on his neck and back or moving him to his side, would he have been able to have been, would he have been alive today? And I'm just going down to get my exact quotations here. Was this a survivable incident for Mr. Floyd? And the doctor said yes. The prosecution then said, who had the best chance of resuscitating Mr. Floyd and saving his life? And he said the officers who were over him at the time. That would he have lived, she had asked just prior to that, if he'd, before he lost consciousness, he'd been positioned in a way to allow him to breathe normally. And the doctor said that he would have lived had he not had that happen, meaning had he not been continued to be restrained. So he's being very clear and very forceful that George Floyd would not have died had he been positioned differently before he lost consciousness. Asked as well, too, about life-saving efforts, had CPR and other life-saving efforts begun immediately after he did lose consciousness, because they believe that was also the time when his heart and lungs stopped functioning. And they believe, too, this would have been a survivable incident had life-saving procedures been applied immediately then after that point when he lost consciousness.
Which kind of gets to the core of the federal charges against these 3 former officers as well. Rob, I need to ask you about the term excited delirium, because that came up again this morning. Very controversial term in the medical field, because the American Medical Association does not officially recognize this as a diagnosis, and it appears that prosecutors were trying to have Dr. Babarda debunk it today.
Yeah, and he had, and they refer to it too as the prosecutors are calling it an agitated state, and so there's been a lot of this excited delirium coming up throughout all this testimony. The trainers from the Minneapolis Police Department, this is where the defense team here, the 3 different teams of defense attorneys, have brought up the excited delirium training. They want to really show that officers here were heavily trained about this state, this agitated state of excited delirium, suggesting perhaps here, and again, we'll find out more when the defense really has a chance to call their own witnesses and it becomes their case, is they reveal more of what their strategy is here. But what it certainly appears to be is that they're trying to paint a picture for the jury that the officers were heavily trained about this condition, and that then it would have been potentially easy for them to diagnose him there in that moment as somebody having this condition, and therefore that maybe then altered the way they responded or didn't respond because they thought this is what was occurring. Now, when he was asked about it, this doctor, he did say, and I'm trying to find my notes here, there's pages and pages of them.
That's okay.
That this is, yeah, this is, sorry about that.
I totally get it.
This is, this is not recognized. It is controversial. He called it a catch-all term for some of these symptoms of people being in an agitated state. And excited delirium is something that is specifically tied to drug use and drug overdoses that lead to this agitated state. And this doctor said that he's seen thousands of patients that fit this criteria during his time in emergency medicine. He said George Floyd did not exhibit any of the 10 symptoms that are assigned to excited delirium in this case. So absolutely that this did not play a part. And he did recognize that the American Medical Association and others do not recognize it as a diagnosed condition, but under cross-examination, the defense, Robert Pauley, who's the first attorney up on cross-examination, pointed out that the American College of Emergency Physicians, or ACEP, of which Dr. Babarda is a member, did publish a white paper in 2009 about excited delirium. A white paper is different from something you might see in a medical journal in that it's not peer-reviewed before publication. Yeah, it is simply just published as background information. So the American College of Emergency Physicians does recognize excited delirium as a condition here. But again, Dr. Babarda testified on direct questioning that George Floyd didn't exhibit any of these symptoms and that he did not die from excited delirium, which usually involves people becoming more agitated and then more of a sudden death. In this case, George Floyd slowed down and his death came on over a matter of those minutes that you see him being restrained on the ground.
Rob, I'm assuming the court is going to get underway again at 2 o'clock this afternoon after the lunch break, and we do expect that Dr. Babarda may be on the stand the rest of the afternoon.
You very easily could be. Cross-examination had just begun around noon, and Robert Pauley, again, he's the attorney for Tutau. He always goes first, and his cross-examinations have been more extensive than the other two. He covers a lot more of the ground in terms of going after a lot of the things that were brought up in direct testimony. And so his cross-examination tends to be very, very thorough. And then when Thomas Plunkett and Earl Gray come up, then they do more follow-up cross-examination that might be more explicit or direct to their particular clients, Alexander Kang and Thomas Lane. So yeah, he could easily be on the stand for a good part of the afternoon, if not the entire afternoon. We'll just kind of see how that goes. But certainly they're going to continue to look at this excited delirium kind of controversy, setting the stage for whether or not these officers were simply, due to their training on it, had made that diagnosis and that influenced their decisions. Another thing that has just come up as we broke for lunch was questions about ketamine. Now, ketamine has come up a number of times during the testimony here. The defense attorneys have brought up ketamine a number of times, and we don't know why they're asking about ketamine, because it was not administered to George Floyd. It is something that EMS does use in cases. It's a sedative, basically, to calm people down. It was not used in this case, so we're not clear why the defense has repeatedly asked witnesses about ketamine. That may become more clear again when they take over the case and start calling their own witnesses as to what the role of that line of questioning is.
All right, sounds good, Rob. We're going to let you wrap it up there and go get your own lunch before you got to get back into court. We're going to have a complete wrap up tonight at 5 o'clock here on Fox 9. And just a reminder, we're here every day at approximately the same time during the lunch break to bring you up to speed on the testimony that's taking place during the day. So again, for all of us here at Fox 9, please join us tomorrow here in the stream on fox9.com and on our YouTube channel. I'm Tim Blotz here at Fox 9. We'll see you on the news here later on tonight.